Hello, folks. Hope you're doing well. So for this introductory lecture, I'm going to talk a bit about the role of parties in a democratic system, as well as I'm going to talk about modern polarization in the United States and what it looks like. So just definitionally, a political party is a group that tries to influence politics by having their members get elected to office. That's what distinguishes parties from interest groups. Interest groups are also groups that try to influence politics, but they do so by trying to persuade those that are in power to go along with their policy preferences, whereas parties are actually trying to get their own members into office. Um, and it's safe to say that there's a lot in the air, in the ether, disdain towards the Democratic and Republican Party today. As this survey shows, right, there's a increasing appetite for third parties and additional parties beyond our two major parties, reflecting kind of the unhappiness that people have with our modern parties in the United States. This unhappiness or this skepticism of parties is nothing new, though. You can go back to the founding era, where, for example, James Madison felt that political parties were factions, right? Kind of these dangerous, self-interested groups that that are opposed to the common will, or only in it for themselves. And as he says later in Federalist Number 10, that these parties and other factions can sow instability, injustice, and confusion in public councils. George Washington, too, in his farewell address, had very negative things to say about political parties. He said that parties would foster a spirit of revenge, quote unquote, and enable the rise of, quote, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men who would usurp themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust domination. So this disdain, this healthy skepticism of political parties is nothing new. The irony, though, right, is that despite Madison's warnings, despite Washington's warnings, despite our modern consternation, we have two major political parties, and we've always had two major political parties ever since shortly after the founding, ever since the election of 1800. Um, as you can see here, right? Like political scientists think about parties in the United States in terms of party systems. A party system is sort of a constellation of parties and the demographic and geographic bases that support those parties. And as you can see, right, we've since the late 18th century, we've had the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. There's what John Adams and Alexander Hamilton on the Federalist side, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison on the Democratic Republican side. Move forward to the mass party era, where there's more mass political participation in the political parties, starting with the Andrew Jackson administration. That's the second party system that pitted the Democrats against the Whigs. So we have, and then from there we've had Republicans and Democrats ever since then, ever since the Civil War. They've shifted their coalitions and shifted their basis. I mean, so the last major realignment of our party system, for example, was after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, which saw Southern Democrats move kind of en masse towards the Republican Party, and the Republican Party becoming a solid, kind of a solidly Republican, the South, excuse me, becoming a solidly Republican area. But so the coalitions have shifted, our parties have shifted, although not that much since the Civil War. But we've always had two major parties, despite again the consternation. This is because parties, as much as maybe we don't like them, solve a number of collective action problems that any modern democracy needs to solve. I'll talk about those in a little bit, but just here's a quote that gets at this idea, right? This necessity of parties. E. Schnatzsnyder, famous political scientist, once said, "The political parties created democracy, and modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of political parties." So these are kind of the three buckets of collective action problems a party solve. A party as an organization, party in the electorate, and party in government. Party organizations, we have the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, the fundraising arms, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Republican National Campaign Committee. Those are all at the federal level. And then we have state parties, right? And then we have kind of local parties. Maybe some of you are familiar or affiliated with the county party locally. And all these organizations at the federal, state, and local level, they coordinate resources for candidates. They provide funding and voter rolls and other resources for candidates. They recruit candidates, which is a really important job. Often it's very hard to find a candidate at all, much less a high quality candidate, particularly for state and local races. And so party organizations make sure that in each race, or as many races as possible, there's a high quality major party candidate running. And they coordinate nomination processes. And this is where the collective action aspect comes in, right? It's without parties kind of coordinating kind of who gets to run for each office, it'd be like herding cats. Like, there'll be like, everybody would be running for president, everybody would be running for Congress, and there would be no way. I guess the political science literature on this talks about it as sort of like, coordinating ambition, right? There would be no coordination of ambition, and there would be no like kind of, here you run for this race, you run for that race, you run for that race. So the kind of, there would be no coordination there, right? The candidate choices would get overloaded. So that's something that the party organizations do, in a modern democracy. Parties also, for the electorate, as we talked about Q taking last class, they create clear choices for voters, right? Like it's, I might not have to know everything about every single candidate and every single platform, but at least theoretically, I can still participate as if I'm a well-informed voter if I follow party cues, right? If I know that, I generally support the types of things that Democrats support, and there's a Democrat and a Republican running, I can vote for the Democrat, and I can be rest assured that that vote is in my interest, even if I don't know every single thing about each candidate down the ballot. That's the theory, at least. We have talked about how that's maybe it doesn't always work like that, right? Or maybe too often we pick a party based on kind of group attachment and um, change our positions on issues based on that group attachment. So kind of the opposite of what like kind of the normatively ideal version of cue taking would dictate. But at least in theory, that's kind of like, the parties simplify things for voters. And then parties in government, right? Like it's they create coalitions and they say, okay, Representative Smith will vote for your priority today, Representative Jones will vote for your priority tomorrow. That kind of process of bundling priorities together to get a coalition that's called log rolling. And if parties weren't there to kind of coordinate things and log roll things and bundle things together, it'd be like herding cats. It'd be like 435 people in the House of Representatives, all with different interests and different priorities and things like that. So, and it'd be hard to get anything done, right? It'd just be kind of chaotic. And so, kind of parties organize that process as well. So why do we have a two-party system? Despite what seems to be a desire to have more parties, right? And kind of maybe a majority of Americans calling, at least in theory, for more parties. It's in through history, again, we've had a two-party system since the late 18th century. We've had major third parties that have made a difference in the past. So there's the Bull Moose Party of Teddy Roosevelt in the past, and the early 20th century. There's Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat Segregationist Party in 1948. There's the Ross Perot and his Reform Party in the 90s that kind of in 1992, 1996, those presidential elections. But by and large, if they pop up, they kind of go away as quickly as they popped up. Why is that? Is it just really kind of the system settles on two major parties? Well, there's a few things we could point to. You could point to kind of a path dependency of existing party identification. So people either identify with or lean towards one party or another, and once they do, they kind of stick with that, right? It's like hard to people people rarely change their partisan identification over time. And there's also maybe some legal advantages, right? It's like, excuse me, it's hard to get on the ballot, right? And major parties are kind of have an easier time getting on the ballot than minor parties. There's limits to who can show up in presidential debates and congressional debates. So often it's candidates that have a certain threshold of support, and the major party candidates tend to satisfy that threshold, and the minor party candidates tend not to. The big reason, though, just popped up, right, is Duverger's law. It's just kind of the way our elections are run. We have first past the post election systems where one person and only one person wins from a district or from a state. I mean, this extends to the electoral college as well, right? Most aside from I think Nebraska and Maine, every other state is a winner take all state with regards to electors in the electoral college system. And that makes it so that kind of creates a psychological incentive to only vote for the top two parties, right? So if only one person wins, right? It's the psychology. I'm not saying this is like normatively correct or whatnot, but it happens. The psychology is if you'll throw your vote away, right? If you vote for the third ranked candidate or fourth ranked candidate or fifth ranked candidate, so. Because of that, because of this first past the post or this winner take all system that we have, there's voters just tend to vote for the top two parties. That's I mean, think about it, right? Like this upcoming election, if you have say, you support say you support Joe Biden, right? And or like you don't want Donald Trump to get back in office, right? And but you prefer a third party candidate over Joe Biden. I mean, if you vote for that third party candidate, you're effectively making it more likely that Donald Trump wins, right? It's like that's kind of the logic that first past the post systems create. Like if you vote outside of the top two parties in a first past the post system, you're actually helping your kind of least favorite major party candidate. So the systems that, as a result, tend to converge around two major parties, as we've seen in the United States through its history. Contrast that to a system with proportional representation, a system where there's like Norway or other European countries where people don't vote for candidates for their legislator, they vote for parties, and they run in the country as a whole as opposed to running for specific districts. So in Norway, when you vote for a candidate, you're voting, or excuse me, vote for the parliament, you're voting for a party list. And so you select the party that you want, and they have like a list of candidates. And so if, for example, one party wins 20% of the vote in Norway's elections, the the legislator gets filled by 20%, is filled 20% with that party, right? So it's a match of the percentage of people voting for the party and the percentage filled with the legislator, and they use the names on the list to fill up that 20%, right? So it creates it's more incentive to vote for minor parties. Like there's a better chance in a proportional representation system like Norway's, where if you vote for the fourth party, the fifth party, the sixth party, that party can realistically get some representation in the legislature, unlike in the United States system. And as you can see, right, here's kind of just recent Norway legislature or parliament makeup. You can see the biggest party is the Labor Party, and they have only roughly a quarter of seats in that legislature, and there's upwards of nine nine parties that have some representation in Norway's legislature. So yeah, way more incentive to vote for third parties. As a result, there are more parties in Norway than we see in the United States. If you want a discussion of why a multi-party system's better and the United States should change to a multi-party system, and recommendations of how the United States could change to a multi-party system, Lee Drutman's book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, is a great resource to go to. Okay, now I'm going to move to a short discussion of modern polarization. There's a lot of hand-wringing around polarization today. I've seen it with students. You see it like polling attests to it, and that's not a kind of controversial thing to say. That being said, like it's interesting how it's kind of shifted over time. Like back in the day, there's actually a concern that there needed to be more polarization in our political system. So this is a fairly famous report from 1950 by the American Political Science Review. It's called Towards a More Responsive Two-Party System. And they argued that there wasn't enough difference at the time. This is like the era of Dwight D. Eisenhower, right? The era of like, really like there's a lot of centrism, and there's a lot of heterogeneity within parties at that time too. There are a lot of conservative Democrats in the South. There are like liberal Rockefeller Republicans in the Northeast, and there are also conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. Like it was like, kind of a jumbled, the two parties really kind of jumbled in interesting ways. And this report says that there's a danger to that, right? Like recall that one of the functions of parties is to provide a kind of a clear cue for voters. Like voters like have to be able to know what they're voting for when they're voting for a party brand. Otherwise, voters just don't know enough to vote for individual candidates in a really effective way. So as a result, they argued that there needed to be kind of greater polarization, more internal cohesion and separation between the parties, and that way voters had more of a meaningful choice. That's what this 1950 report argues. Well, they got what they wished for, right? Like that's like the kind of this call for a more internally cohesive, kind of ideologically farther apart parties has come to pass, certainly in the 21st century. And in thinking about polarization, and just kind of describing what polarization looks like today, there's some important distinctions to make. First, there's the question of who's polarizing. Is it the elites of our system? Is it our politicians, our donors and activists, media figures, things like that? Is it just them, right? Or is the public as a whole, like John Q. Public, you and me, are they splitting apart in similar ways? Maybe not, right? Um, there's also a distinction between what's called ideological polarization and affective polarization. Ideological or issue-based polarization is just polarization on the substance of politics, polarization on the issues. Are Democrats and Republicans farther apart on healthcare, on taxes, on immigration, on racial issues, et cetera, et cetera? Versus a distinct concept, affective polarization. This is the social and emotional distance between Democrats and Republicans. Do Democrats and Republicans hate each other more than they used to? Do they try to stay away from each other more than they used to? Do they not make friends or go into relationships with each other more so than they used to? And these two concepts, ideological and affective polarization, are conceptually distinct. In fact, there's a great book by Liliana Mason called Uncivil Agreement, and it talks about how we've seen greater mass polarization in the public without greater ideological polarization. It goes to the title. I think kind of we might agree on the issues, but we hate each other and fight nonetheless. So we have affective polarization, even though the amount of ideological polarization can certainly be overstated. I'm going to tease that idea out in just a little bit, but that's kind of the thrust of Mason's book, and it shows how the hate and the distance apart on issues can be conceptually distinct. All right, so who is polarizing? The public, you and me, or political elites? Well, this short article, a really interesting short article, kind of shows that they're both polarizing, but in different ways. They take a survey of and compare surveys more or less between the public and surveys of elected officials that have gone to national conventions. These are kind of like the elite of the elite, right? Kind of those elected officials that are party insiders enough to attend and be delegates in national conventions. And what they find, right, is that elites, these delegate attendees, are both ideologically and affectively polarized. So on the left is a measure of ideological polarization. You can see the Democrats and Republicans are farther apart. Their density plots are farther apart for elites than they are for the masses, meaning there's much more overlap in opinion amongst Democrats and Republicans in the masses than there are in with elites. Similarly, like elites are more affectively polarized. Like this is kind of a measure of affective polarization, and you can see elites are farther apart than the public is here as well. So elites are both more ideologically and affectively polarized than the public, and this chart's also showing that the public's more affectively polarized than ideologically polarized. Again, if you look at panel A, you can see that there's a decent amount of overlap in the opinion based on, and again, this is a density plot. It's kind of an index of a bunch of different issue questions, and they're plotting where respondents, Democratic and Republican respondents chart on this index of issue questions. And you can see there's a lot of overlap in panel A, and less overlap with regards to affective polarization on panel B, suggesting there's more affective polarization than ideological polarization in the public. And just kind of here's the kind of some of these measures over time, right? You can see that in the circles are delegates, and the solid dots are the public. You can see that the elites have long been affectively polarized. That thermometer-based or affective polarization score has been high since the 70s. And in recent decades, going from the 80s till the 2000s, the elites have grown in issue-based or ideological polarization too. And so again, it goes back in the day, there were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and there was this less ideological polarization in as panel A suggests in the 20th century, and then there's more ideological polarization amongst elites today. With the public, with the dotted lines, you can see that there's kind of higher affective polarization than ideological polarization. The party differences are higher in the right side of the graph as opposed to the left side of the graph. And there's just greater growth of affective polarization over the past number of decades as opposed to growth in ideological polarization. This also suggests too, like there's a kind of a lingering question of in thinking about like why we're so polarized. There's a chicken and the egg question. Are elites polarized because the public is super polarized and they want them to be polarized, or does the public follow elite cues? Did elites like get polarized first and the public's following the cues of you can think of any polarized elite in your mind, right? Like, are they following those cues? And this sort of suggests the latter, right? This sort of suggests that polarization is an elite-driven process where elites, kind of have hated each other for a while, and the public's kind of following the cue of elite hateful rhetoric and elite hateful or affectively polarized disposition. So and again, that's not the only study. Like a lot of studies show that the public is actually less divided or less polarized in the issues than one may think. And it's, or at least one would think, just looking at media discourse and elite rhetoric and whatnot. While the public hasn't been polarizing, at least at the same clip that elites have been polarizing on ideological lines, the public has been sorting, though. So party sorting is the extent to which one matches or has matched their issue positions with their party allegiance. So if all Democrats or most Democrats in the public are liberal on a bunch of issues, and all or most conservatives in the public are conservative, or all most Republicans in the public are conservative on a bunch of issues, that's a sorted party system. Like, there's not this overlap of like liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats and whatnot. And again, distinct from polarization, like the public can like believe the same things and just kind of like sort themselves better. And in fact, that's kind of what we're seeing, right? We see kind of a more sorted public than we did in the past. You can see this here. Back in the 90s, roughly a third of Republicans were more liberal on a set of issue questions than the median Democrat, and 30% or so of Democrats were more conservative on those same issue questions than the median Republican. Fast forward to 2017, and there are very few Republicans that are more liberal than your median Democrat, and very few Democrats that are more conservative than your median Republican. So kind of more neatly sorted, across people matching their ideology and their issue positions with their party to a greater degree. We can ask why that is, and again, like there's a lot of studies that kind of try to probe that question of this sorting. Do we see? Is it because people are switching parties? To match their issue positions, or are they switching their issue positions to match their party? I think a lot of it is the latter. I mean, there is a little bit of both, right? Like you could think of, particularly, more engaged and kind of highly knowledgeable partisans will in fact switch their party allegiance if it doesn't match their issue positions. You can think of maybe country club or suburban folk that they are business friendly folk that used to be Republican, but now they're more likely to be Democrat, or folks in the Rust Belt, right? Or maybe like the white working class, white blue collar folks, right? That maybe in the past era they used to be Democrat, now they're more likely to be Republican. So we do see party switching, right? But a lot of it, more often than not, like it's where this is kind of the cynical take, but the psychologically true take. A lot of it is people switching their opinions to match their party allegiances, and you can see shifts in what people think about different issues based on cues given by the party, or if there's a shift in the party platform, you see a shift in what the person thinks about it. So putting identity first and kind of issue position second. The public's sorting, but maybe not ideologically polarizing. There has been this growth of affective polarization in the public, though. I mean, we've already touched on this in our class, and kind of here's just some of a lot of data you can point to show this growing affective polarization. The percentage of folks that say that have a very unfavorable view of their out party has grown tremendously. It's 62% of Republicans and 52% or 54% of Democrats. There's an increase in negative trait aspiration, right? So I'll get to like affective polarization is primarily a negative phenomenon. We're not seeing a whole lot more in-party love, or like in-party enthusiasm amongst partisans. We're seeing this more out-party hate. That's what's really driving that negative partisanship is really driving affective polarization. And you see evidence of it here, right? Where like we're increasingly likely to call the out party closed-minded, dishonest, unintelligent, lazy, and immoral, right? We are number one with regards to affective polarization. This is an interesting study from Boxell and colleagues, more or less kind of matching up affective polarization measures across countries. And they find that the US has had the strongest growth in affective polarization as compared to other countries across the globe. There's been plenty of countries that have like seen higher levels of affective polarization, but not as high as the United States. Maybe in class we can talk about why is that? Why is the United States uniquely as compared to other Western countries polarized, affectively polarized in this way? The public is affectively polarized, not ideologically polarized as much. We can ask though, like, there's been good, what is the growth of independent identification mean for all this, right? Like it's, can we really say that we're polarized when, the plurality of individuals, as this chart suggests, are identifying as independent? Well, I mean, that's a fair critique. The one thing I would respond to is it's that many independents, as we talked about with the Klar and Krupnikoff reading, are actually, behave very much like partisans. So the standard question when you ask about partisanship in a survey is you ask if people consider themselves to be Democrat, Republican, independent, or what. If they say independent or other, you ask, okay, do you lean towards one party or the other party? And most people that identify as independent, they're leaners, right? Like very few people, when you ask that second question, like maybe 10% or so, will stick to their guns and say, no, I'm a true independent. As this, the leaners are the striped lines, the striped parts of the line that you can see below. You can see a significant chunk of folks that identify as independent. They're either leaning Republican or leaning Democrat, right? And that gray bar is that percentage is like a pure independent. It doesn't lean one way or the other. That's a pretty small percentage. And the research shows that we see affective polarization with independent leaners as well. And the independent leaners behave really pretty similarly with regards to negative party affect, with regards to voting behavior, with regards to other measures. They behave very similarly to identified partisans. So again, it kind of gets at the idea of like polarization, affective polarization being kind of a negative phenomenon, right? So maybe these people are independent, but they lean towards the Republicans, and they still really hate Democrats as much as a out and out Republican identifier does, for example. That's just a tour of parties in democracy as well as partisan polarization. In class we'll talk about why we're so polarized. We'll get to the why question and draw on Drutman's writing to try to adjudicate that. Till then, I hope you guys have a great day and weekend and whatnot, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.